Angola. The operating environment there offshore and the deep offshore has been very difficult. They peaked at about 2 million barrels a day, and then they've been steadily dropping since. I see that coming back. But of course, the single biggest player in LNG is going to be the United States, because you will be able to play. LNG is not covered by the omnibus bill from 2015, so Biden cannot shut it down. So I can certainly see American investors investing more and more in LNG liquefaction in the United States in order to take advantage of the arbitrage to get to Europe, for example. Just keep in mind that liquefaction takes a lot longer to build out than regasification. So the Germans are planning 2 big regasification facilities that they hope will be online by the end of next year. Pretty aggressive, but doable. Filling that with new LNG from the United States, that's a 6 to a 10-year project. We'd have to actually build significant more trunk lines to get to some of these places, because we've kind of tapped that out with the LNG liquefaction that we have already built. So you don't just have to build the chillers, you have to build the infrastructure to bring it to the chillers, multi-years.
Thanks. We also have some questions here that are sort of beyond the immediate scope of energy. But there are several about your forecast on the future of places like Poland and the Baltic states.
Well, let me put this map back up. Yeah. The short version, it's to be determined. So here's the map of where the Russians ultimately want to go. I think they're going to conquer Ukraine in its totality in less than 6 months, along with Moldova almost as a kicker. And then as soon as they feel that they've pacified Ukraine sufficiently, they're going to make a move on Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, and Northeast Romania. That would allow them to plug all of the gateways, and then they would have them all. And that is where the Russians would probably stop. What I expect to go on diplomatically over the course of the next 3 months is with pipelines like Turk Stream or Blue Stream, with pipelines like Nord Stream 1, the Russians are going to make the case to the Germans and the Turks that, look, we have the infrastructure in place to keep you supplied. We have enough oil to keep you supplied. If you want that to continue, NATO has to break. If NATO breaks, Russia will have a significantly easier time going after these states, and the nuclear deterrent probably won't be as much of a factor, because it's difficult from my point of view to see the Americans supporting these states as strongly as we're supporting Ukraine if a couple key allies that are frontline states peel out of the situation. That's the Russian play. Whether it will work, I have no idea. If you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said, yeah, it's not going to work. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that the Russian play probably is going to work. But the Germans have doubled their defense spending in a day. The Europeans, there's now protest movements in Berlin that says, what is it? Cold for peace. Like, we're willing to go cold in the winter if it means that the war stops. This sort of earthquake in public perception of how energy and security interplay, we have not seen this in Europe since before the Second World War. And it all happened in a 3-day window. So we really are kind of whispering in the wind here. So when Ukraine is done, we'll reassess. But right now, I just have no idea. And the whole goal for NATO here now is to make sure that Ukraine is never done. If the Russians are locked up in a decade-long insurgency, and that requires the majority of the deployable troops, then they can't move on against the next wave of countries. And that prevents NATO from ever having to make this decision in the first place. And that is absolutely what NATO policy is right
All right. We're actually running up against a hard deadline for another meeting, but I think we can take another question. This will address a couple of comment. Broadly speaking, what do you see as China's level of involvement, I think, with the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, but sort of more broadly speaking over the next 12, 24, 36 months.
Sure, leaving aside Ukraine and Russia themselves, I think the biggest loser from all of this is China. Uh, the scale of the global outrage and action, no one expected that. The Chinese certainly didn't. And so when they're looking at things like their next step, or maybe a Taiwan war, and they're realizing that there really will be a devastating price. And while the West is finding ways to at least wrestle with the idea of getting by without Russian energy, it's really easy to boycott China. If they can't get energy, they deindustrialize and decivilize in a matter of months. They're far more vulnerable to the sort of tools that are now in play. They're really terrified of what the Americans and the Europeans have managed to do with sanctioning the Russian central bank, and that all of the currency reserves that they have accumulated over all this time may actually be useless. There's also the not so minor issue that the only world leader that Xi has talked to in the last 2 years face to face was Putin, and Putin lied to him. So they're seeing their only ally, if that's the right word, as being warmongering, unreliable, and breaking new ground in the ability of the West to force things on other cultures. They are very unhappy right now. They're very unhappy with everybody. The biggest concern that I have in China is that Xi has, well, he's shot the messenger so many times that no one wants to bring him bad news. I would love to know how soon he found out about the Ukraine war, because I doubt it was the first day. When the power outages hit last May, he probably didn't find out about those until September. So we're seeing a breakdown in decision-making capacity in the Chinese system. And as Russian energy, as Russian exports get incrementally pushed out of the system, this is going to go one of two ways. Either number one, the Europeans are going to have a come to Jesus meeting when they realize they can't do this without pain. They're not willing to suffer, in which case China's okay. Or two, the Europeans decide they are willing to suffer it, and they are going to do sanctions on everything that the Russians sell, in which case China is now the biggest buyer of everything. And then China has to start navigating a world where everyone is looking at them as being a bag of dicks. And when that happens, we get sanctions on the Russians that are designed to hurt the Chinese. We're not there yet. But if the Europeans stick to their guns on this, that is where we're going.